The story of the UK is an economy that has got real momentum.
What is broken can be repaired. What is ruined can be rebuilt.
UK inflation is becoming much more homegrown.
We have huge potential as an economy in the UK.
This is a time to tell Israel there is a path to peace.
Our plan for the British economy is working, but the work is not done.
You're listening to Bloomberg UK Politics. I'm Stephen Carroll.
And I'm Caroline Hepker. Coming up on today's programme, well, it's Wednesday, so it's Prime Minister's Questions.
Plenty on the agenda that the leaders can discuss. What will you be watching out for, Caroline?
I mean, surely there'll be a word on the King's cancer treatment. No doubt an opening line on that. But also maybe Liz Truss's launch of her new faction within the Tories called Popular Conservatism, Popcons for short, launched yesterday. I suspect Keir Starmer could take a pop at the Prime Minister on that.
Popcons to popcorn, maybe, today's Prime Minister's Questions. There has, though, been some good news on the property front, because we know that housing and mortgages come up a lot in Prime Minister's Questions. If you're a homeowner, it looks like property prices have bottomed out. Halifax reporting that house prices rose at their strongest pace since the middle of 2022. In January, home prices rose by 2.5% compared to the previous year. So that's good news if you're a homeowner. Less good news, I suppose, if you're trying to buy. And certainly not good news from another report from Capital Economics talking about rents soaring. Yeah, absolutely. So that on the property front. I mean, something, though, that I think will probably not get a mention, but frankly I think is the more fascinating story, is that Bloomberg has crunched the numbers on migration. So remember that the ONS last week talked about migration likely to settle at historically high levels in the future. Well, actually, it could mean a bigger boost for the UK economy going forwards. That won't please Keir Starmer. Well, that won't please the Prime Minister. Let's listen in to the Labour leader, Keir Starmer.
We all look forward to seeing him back to full health as quickly as possible. Mr. Speaker, this week the unwavering bravery of Brianna Ghey's mother, Esther, has touched us all. As a father, I can't even imagine the pain that she's going through, and I'm glad that she's with us in the gallery here today. Mr. Speaker, a year ago, the Prime Minister promised to bring NHS waiting lists down. Isn't he glad he didn't bet £1,000 on it?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, at least I stand by my commitments. He's so indecisive, the only bet he'd make is an each-way bet.
Well, Mr. Speaker, he says he stands by his commitments. He once insisted that if he missed his promises, these are the words he used, I'm the Prime Minister, and then he said, it's on me personally. Today we learned from his own officials that he's the blocker to any deal to end the doctors' strikes. Yep. And he's always, every time he's asked, he blames everyone else. So what exactly did he mean when he said it's on him personally if he doesn't meet his promise?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, well, we are bringing the waiting list down for the longest waiters. We're making progress. But it's a bit rich, Mr. Speaker, to hear about promises from someone who's broken every single promise he was elected on. I mean, I think I counted almost 30 in the last year. Pensions, planning, peerages, public sector pay, tuition fees, childcare, second referendums, defining a woman. Although in fairness, that was only 99% of a U-turn. The list goes on, but the theme is the same, Mr. Speaker. It's empty words, broken promises, and absolutely no plan.
Keir Starmer.
Of all the weeks to say that, when Brianna's mother is in this chamber, shame, parading as a man of integrity when he's got absolutely no responsibility. Absolute. Of all.
Either side. I think the member's getting carried away. Can I just say that our constituents want to hear the questions and they certainly want to hear the answers. They don't want to hear organised barracking. So please, I want no more. Keir Starmer.
I think the role of the Prime Minister is to ensure that every single citizen in this country feels safe and respected. It's a shame the Prime Minister doesn't share that. I welcome the fact that he's finally admitted that he's failed on waiting lists in the NHS. I also welcome that he's finally acknowledged the crisis in NHS dentistry. He's calling it a recovery plan after 14 years of Tory government. What exactly does he think the NHS dentistry is recovering from? Prime Minister.
As ever, Mr. Speaker, he seems to convene.
Certainly not have enough of the front bench either. Please, I want to hear it. The election fever, I'm hoping, is not coming tomorrow, so let's not behave as though it is. Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, as ever, he conveniently forgets the impact of a pandemic on NHS dentistry, and it was specifically because of the close proximity nature of dental provision that it was unable to operate as normal throughout the pandemic. That was the recommendation of the medical and clinical experts, Mr. Speaker, which is why inevitably there is a backlog in dental care and the impact that it has. But that's why, as my honourable friend, the Health Secretary, will outline later today for the House, we're putting more funding in to provide more NHS provision across the country, on top of plans that will see the number of dental training places increased by 40%, Mr. Speaker. But I would actually just point out, our plans mean that there will be 2.5 million more NHS appointments, which is in fact 3 times more than the Labour Party are proposing.
Mr. Speaker, there are some areas in the country where you literally can't have an NHS dentist, and he says that's down to COVID. People are literally pulling out their own teeth.
Sorry. Can I just say, I don't need any more off this front bench either. Do we understand each other? Carry on, Keir Starmer.
Speaker, people are literally pulling their teeth out using pliers. It's an experience that can be compared with extracting an answer from the Prime Minister at this dispatch box. The truth is, after 14 years of neglect, this recovery plan is just a desperate attempt to try to recover back to square one. If he wanted to move forward, he should follow Labour, scrap the non-dom tax status, use the money to fund 2 million more hospital appointments every year. But, Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister is oddly reluctant to follow us on this. What exactly is so special about this tax avoidance scheme that the Prime Minister prioritises it above the NHS?
Well, Mr. Speaker, let's look at that record. We've, in the NHS, record funding, record doctors and nurses, record number of appointments, higher cancer survival rates. But what's happening under Labour's watch in Wales, Mr. Speaker? Let's have a look. A fifth of people in Wales are currently on a waiting list. Waits of 18 months or more are 10 times higher than that in England, and people are waiting twice as long for an operation. Their failure has sent the Welsh NHS back to square one, and we'll never let them do that here.
Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, when he admitted that he'd failed on waiting lists, I actually thought that we might be entering a new era of integrity, professionalism and accountability. Remember that one? But just like all the other relaunches, it's proved to be a false dawn, still blaming everyone else, still removed from reality. It's very simple. You can either back more NHS appointments or more tax avoidance. We know what side we're on. Why doesn't he?
Mr. Speaker, the best way to ensure that we continue to fund the NHS, as we have, is not to make £28 billion of unfunded spending commitments. And just this morning, independent Treasury officials have published a formal costing of just one part of their eco-promise, their insulation scheme, and it turns out that it will cost double what they had previously claimed. Not the £6 billion that Labour accounted for, but £13 billion every single year. It's now crystal clear they have absolutely no plan, but we all know how they're going to fund that gap. More taxes on hard-working people.
Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, this is Mr. 25 tax rises. He's literally the country's expert on putting taxes up, and he thinks he can lecture everyone else on the economy. Last week, he and his MPs were laughing at someone whose mortgage had gone up £1,000 a month. This week, he's casually made a £1,000 bet in the middle of an interview. Last week, he thought even raising questions about the cost of living was, and I quote, resorting to the politics of envy. And this week, he's finally found the cause that he wants to rally around, the non-dom status. When he finds himself backing tax avoidance over NHS appointments, does he start to understand why his own MPs are saying he simply does not get what Britain needs?
Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, I'm not going to take any lectures about getting Britain from a man who thought it was right to defend terrorists, Mr. Speaker. But what we're doing is building a brighter future for our country. In just the last week, expanding healthcare in pharmacies. Today, expanding dental care. This week, helping millions with the cost of living. And most importantly, cutting national insurance. All while the Labour Party argue over 28 billion different ways to raise people's taxes. That's the difference between us. We're delivering a plan. They can't even agree on one.
That was the Prime Minister and the Labour leader facing off at this week's Prime Minister's Questions. I think we probably could have expected that Keir Starmer would have brought up that bet that Rishi Sunak made with the TV presenter Piers Morgan, that £1,000 that Rwanda deportation flights would take off before the general election. I don't think we were expecting, though, what was the real shocking moment, I think, of that Prime Minister's Questions, when the Prime Minister made a comment about about Keir Starmer's stance on trans rights. This while Keir Starmer had pointed out at the start of Prime Minister's Questions that the mother of a transgender teenager was in the gallery, and she had been listening into that exchange, and this was after two
shouts
teenagers.
Of shame, basically, shouts of shame across the chamber. Look, I think that was a very... it was very difficult to try to make a joke at the expense of the opposition leader on such an immensely serious topic, that the murder of that transgender teen, having dominated coverage in the UK for many weeks and months. But also, I think the comment from the House Speaker that election fever is not coming tomorrow simply underlines how testy, again, these exchanges are becoming. I mean, it does feel like they're ratcheting up in tension. And there was a lot of talk of personal responsibility, was the accusation from Keir Starmer to the Prime Minister. And then the Prime Minister was sort of pushing it back the other way, saying, what about your promises? You have absolutely no plan. It's empty words from the Labour leader. So, as I say, week by week, it feels like things are becoming increasingly testy.
And it does make you wonder whether Rishi Sunak is cracking under the pressure of that from within his own party as well. I mean, the bet with Piers Morgan was extremely poorly received afterwards, and
£1,000 after the cost of living crisis that we've had, it does leave the Prime Minister open to Keir Starmer's accusation of being out of touch with ordinary people. There was a moment, and again, it's the thing is the issues around. Perhaps not everybody is focused on transgender rights. A lot of voters, though, are fully focused on the NHS, on dentistry, and that was the kind of bread and butter issue that was the bedrock of this discussion. And
they come back to questions of compassion as well,
yes.
and how the Prime Minister is being viewed as someone who cares, who is invested in, as he said, cutting NHS waiting lists when the problems are so difficult, and we know that there are so many people who are waiting to be seen for medical treatment, and the defence of pointing to the NHS in Wales and the problems that exist there, of course under a Labour-run government in Wales, don't seem to be deflecting from the bigger problem, which is that people are still having problems accessing treatment.
Yeah, absolutely. Although the dentistry issue, the severe lack of dentistry, I mean, something that we devoted a whole programme to on the Bloomberg Politics podcast, is, from the Prime Minister's perspective, also one of the pandemic. And I do think that that's a point, sort of well made, that part of the issue was the difficulty of getting dentistry delivered during that pandemic issue.
Yeah, so I mean, as ever, we find ourselves in a Prime Minister's Questions, as they have been stepping up over past weeks and months as well, as we move towards the election, becoming as much about tone as they are about content. Rishi Sunak, used his usual lines, back to square one with Labour, broken promises, no plan. We heard all the usual lines coming from the Prime Minister, but the question of tone, and certainly the ferocity of exchanges between the two leaders as well is something we're likely to see an awful lot more of in the coming months.
Yeah,
too.
and I wonder whether Keir Starmer's line, Mr. 25 tax rises, will that cut through to voters? Who, of course, are, very much concerned about still the cost of living, inflation, when we're going to see the Bank of England cut interest rates, which sort of takes us on to our next conversation.
Yeah, we're going to talk a little bit about some new research from the National Institute of Economic and Social Research, known as NISR, predicting that UK households will start to feel a bit better off this year. Crucially, that improvement in living standards of around 1.5% over the next 2 years is expected to kick in before the election. We've been talking about this with the Deputy Director of NISR, Stephen Millard. We started off by asking him what's behind the predicted improvements in UK households' fortunes.
So it's two things, really. One is wages, which will continue to rise. And in particular, the increases in the national living wage, national minimum wage will kick in. Against that, the rate of inflation itself has fallen quite dramatically. So it's now right down around the Bank of England's target, and we expect it to remain there over the next couple of years. So higher wage growth, lower price growth in prices, so people will feel better off.
OK, so will everyone feel better off, though, to the same extent? Because you've underlined that the poorest households will actually see much slower improvement.
No, this is true. Unfortunately, the poorest households have been the ones that were most badly hit by the cost of living crisis. And so their real incomes relative to pre-COVID have actually fallen by more than other households. And the growth in real income standard of living for them will be just a little bit slower than for others, but it is definitely improving.
There's the question too of how much people will feel in this data as well. 1.5% doesn't sound like a huge difference. Do you think that people will genuinely notice feeling better off by the latter half of the year when we're expecting the election to happen?
Well, that is the $6 million question. People will notice that their wages are going up, that their incomes are going up faster than prices, I think. Will that mean that they'll necessarily feel better off? I mean, given, as you say, that incomes are rising, or real incomes are rising by so little, it's not clear that they will necessarily. But we will have to wait and see.
OK, so we'll see whether people notice it, how much they notice it. You've also got some insights, though, into your view on the economy, on inflation, which a lot of people still see and expect to be actually pretty volatile, and then also economic growth, that is still, perhaps Britain's biggest challenge.
Absolutely. So we think the economy was actually in recession at the back end of last year with real output falling. We expect real output to grow over the coming year, but by less than 1%. So it's really slow growth of the economy. And it's been like that for a while. And we expect, unfortunately, that it's going to continue like that for the foreseeable future, with a trend growth rate now of only 1%. On the inflation side of things, yes, inflation is going to drop very quickly in the first half of this year, but then it's going to be quite volatile over the coming months after that. It will probably drop to something around 1.5% or so, then bounce back to something a little bit over 2%, and then keep bouncing. But it will remain relatively close to the 2% target that the Bank of England is targeting.
Talk us through as well your outlook for where you think interest rates are going to go, because you see them settling at quite a high level.
Well, there are two aspects to that. So one is that we see interest rates falling from May of this year, and that's got to be good news, in particular for mortgage holders. As you say, we see them settling at around about 3.25%. Now, whether you think that's a high level, it is relative to the decade, I guess, of the run into COVID, but it's much more what you might consider to be normal levels of interest rates. And we're, in that sense, in line with the market that has actually adjusted its view on where interest rates will settle down towards where we were always thinking they were going to settle.
One of the things that it kind of, when we're thinking of this in a context of being in the run-up to election, one of the things your report points out is the regional discrepancies between parts of the UK that are going to feel this bounce of living standards and those that aren't. Can you highlight some of the underperforming regions for us as we're thinking, I suppose, how that might affect voters' intentions?
Well, it's the Midlands, really, that have been struggling relative to the other regions. And this, to a large extent, is to do with the exposure of that area of the country to trade. And of course, trade has been quite badly affected by Brexit. And it's the Midlands where you see that actually happening. The other regions, they've all now recovered to where they were pre-COVID. London, as ever, is leading the way. But really, it's the Midlands who have been feeling the pinch.
How do you think that the government, either this government or the next government, can actually build on these improvements? We are not quite in electioneering, but we're pretty close to that now. Can the government do anything further to turn things around swiftly? And what are the policy prescriptions then, that you talk about pretty frequently for the next government?
Well, I think the government could decide, if it wanted to generate a boom in the year of an election, it could decide to cut taxes. But we think that would not be a very sensible thing to do at this juncture. We think what the government should be doing is thinking more about the longer term, beyond, if you like, the general election. And we think it should be taking steps to tackle our long-term growth issues. And the key aspect of that is public investment in infrastructure, investment in education, investment in healthcare, which for a decade or more has been woefully low in this country. So that would be what we would be pushing for. The other thing we'd like to see actually quite urgently is some extra additional funds for local authorities, given the number that are fairly close to bankruptcy at the minute. That seems something that needs to be done pretty quickly. But again, the main issue is trying to build up the capacity for growth in the future.
And if you were to score it, how likely do you think it is that the Sunak government will deliver on that? As you say, huge pressure on local councils.
Well, I would be very surprised if there were not some additional funding going into local councils. I think this is is a pretty clear priority at the minute. On the public investment thing, I think that's I would suggest that was possibly less likely. Again, it's an election year, and my suspicion is that the government will try and engineer some kind of feel-good factor via tax cuts.
But you're looking for a target of... Sorry to talk across you, Stephen, but you're looking for a target of 4% of GDP for public investment. When was the last time the UK invested at that level?
That is a very good question. I'm going to have a guess, but it is unfortunately a guess, that it was probably back in the 1970s, perhaps even earlier than that. It's public investment has been low for decades now. That said, we expect over the fiscal year that we're in at the minute, public investment to reach 3.8% of GDP, so almost at 4% now. So it's really a case of just maintaining that level of public investment, as opposed to what was in the autumn statement, which is that level of investment fell off as a percentage of GDP.
So that's Stephen Millard, the Deputy Director of NISR, speaking to us a little bit earlier about the report looking at the improvement in UK households' living standards due to come, after we'll all be breathing a sigh of relief, very soon, by the sounds of things there as well. I didn't mean to stump him with that question about when historically last hit 4%. I'm quite sure that he's right, that it was as far back as the 1970s. But I suppose the idea, if you say something like 4% of GDP, like...
what does that mean?
Yeah,
yes.
I mean, what I was interested in, what I was trying to get at was how far away we are from that now and when it was last done. And as he pointed out, actually spending is not very far off it now, but historically it's been quite a long time, and of course that has a cumulative effect.
Yeah, look, Also, I think this is hugely important, right? And that's why we asked Stephen the question about whether actually voters are going to feel better off or not. Because, we've been saying for many, many months that the general election is probably going to be fought on the basis of the economy, how people are feeling financially in terms of inflation, of food prices, as well as all the other issues, crime and the NHS and so on. But it's totally fascinating. And Nisa, that has been quite, is often quite critical of government, and of policies that the UK's attempted, and really does want to see things like more economic growth and better distribution of wealth across the country, that they are saying perhaps there's a little chink of light, although it comes with a huge number of caveats too.
Yes, indeed. And of course, we won't know until we get the latest OBR forecast exactly how much money the government has to spend ahead of the budget on the 6th of March anyway. But that's it from us for today. If you like the programme, don't forget to subscribe and give it 5 stars so other people can find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify or wherever you listen.
This episode was produced by Tiwa Adebayo. Our audio engineer was Marufal Hussain. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. We'll be back with more tomorrow. This is Bloomberg.
Bloomberg UK Politics. Listen weekdays at noon on DAB Digital Radio in London.